Welcome to our deep dive on grammar. Yeah, we're going to be unpacking some really interesting stuff from this online video lesson you shared with me about how language actually works.
Oh, cool.
I have to admit, at first, when you said grammar deep dive, I was like, oh.
Right.
But this video lesson was actually super engaging, and I kind of realized that grammar is way more interesting than I thought it was.
Yeah, I think grammar gets a bad rap,
Yeah,
but it's really like the secret code to clear and effective communication.
I like that. Secret code.
Yeah, and like any code, once you understand it, you can use it precisely, even with a little bit of flair.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what really surprised me in this video was how just like a simple comma can make such a huge difference. They had this really funny example about a comma literally saving a grandma's life.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later.
Oh, wow.
But it shows how punctuation isn't just about rules, it's about making sure what you mean is clear.
Right.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves before we get to like the nuances of punctuation. We need to start with the basics like sentence structure.
Yeah, it all starts with those fundamental building blocks like subject, verb, object.
Yeah.
The video used the example she reads.
Right.
She being the subject reads, being the verb, the action itself.
Mm-hmm.
And you could even add an object like a book to make the picture complete.
It's amazing how much information we can pack into even a simple sentence.
Right.
Like, she reads a book that paints a whole scene in 3 words.
I know.
But it really makes you realize how important it is to get that structure right, especially when you're like writing a paper or you're working on like a document that's more complex or technical. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, like a solid understanding of sentence structure is like having a blueprint for communication.
Right.
It helps you organize your thoughts and present your ideas in a way that people can follow easily if your sentences are like rambling or disjointed. It's like trying to build a house without a foundation.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And speaking of things that can trip us up, let's talk about commonly confused words like therein and there. Why are those little words so tricky?
It's funny how those words sound exactly the same but have completely different meanings.
Yeah.
There shows possession there is a contraction of they are, and there refers to a place. And
Right.
I think the reason they're so easy to mix up is because we're processing language by sound instead of spelling,
Mhm.
especially when we're writing quickly.
That's so true. And sometimes I feel like my brain is trying to be efficient, but sometimes the efficiency backfires and like I end up using the wrong one in an email or something. It's a little embarrassing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We all have those moments.
Uh,
I think the key is just to be aware of those common traps and to take that extra moment to proofread.
right. Especially for anything important.
Yes, definitely.
So speaking of important writing, let's talk about punctuation. Now, I'll admit punctuation used to be kind of a mystery to me. Like I knew the basic rules, but never really understood the nuances. But this video lesson was like a light bulb moment for me. It's not just about following arbitrary rules. It's about shaping the flow and meaning of your writing.
Yeah, punctuation is like the conductor of an orchestra. It guides the reader through the text,
Mm-hmm.
like telling them when to pause, when to emphasize, and when to take a breath.
Mm-hmm.
And just like a conductor can change the feeling of a piece of music, punctuation can change the tone and meaning of your words.
That is such a powerful image. It really makes you realize that punctuation isn't just about being grammatically correct. It's about being an effective communicator.
Right.
And like, remember that example about saving grandma's life with a comma?
Oh, yeah, the classic let's eat grandma versus let's eat grandma.
Exactly.
It perfectly illustrates how a comma can completely transform a sentence, going from a scary suggestion to an invitation to dinner.
Totally. And it's not just about avoiding those misunderstandings. Punctuation can help us convey emotions and add emphasis and even like create a rhythm in our writing. Like we have this whole toolkit of punctuation marks at our disposal.
Yeah, it's like we have the colors and the shapes, but it's those subtle details that really bring the artwork to life.
I love that. And now, before we move on to some of the other interesting aspects of grammar we found in this video, I'm curious, have you ever noticed how punctuation affects the way you read out loud?
That's interesting.
Mm.
I think punctuation is like a subconscious guide for our intonation and pacing when we read.
Yeah.
Like those marks are telling us how to bring the words to life.
It's amazing how much thought goes into writing a good sentence. It's like we're composing a symphony with every paragraph.
Totally.
But now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another essential element of grammar that I think trips a lot of people up, subject-verb agreement. I think we've all had moments where we've struggled with this.
Yeah, subject-verb agreement. It seems straightforward in theory, but in practice it gets tricky.
Hmm.
The basic rule is the verb in a sentence must agree with its subject in number. So singular subject, singular verb, plural subject, plural verb, but there are so many nuances and exceptions.
Right. And it's not just about sounding proper. It's about making sure our writing is clear. If you read a sentence where the subject and verb don't agree, it's like a musical note that's slightly off key.
Exactly. And just like those off-key notes can be jarring to the ear, subject-verb agreement errors can be distracting to the reader. It disrupts the flow, and it can make the writing seem less credible.
So it's definitely something worth paying attention to, even if it seems like a small detail. But, something that stood out to me in the video lesson was how they pointed out that collective nouns like team or family can be either singular or plural depending on the
Oh,
context.
that's a great point.
Yeah, it was kind of an aha moment for me.
Yeah, collective nouns can be tricky because they represent a group of individuals but can be treated as a single entity. So you might say the team is winning, referring to the team as a unit.
Right.
But you could also say that the team are celebrating, emphasizing the individual members.
It's like one of those optical illusions where you see different images depending on how you look at it. The words are the same, but the meaning shifts.
It is it reminds us that language is dynamic
Yeah.
and that context plays a crucial role in shaping meaning.
And that's what makes grammar so fascinating. It's not just about following these rigid rules. It's about understanding the nuances of language and using them to our advantage.
Right.
I completely agree. Now, I know we have a lot more ground to cover in our deep dive, including those tenses and those pesky double negatives. But before we move on, what has been the most surprising or insightful takeaway for you?
You know what struck me is how much of grammar is about intention. It's not about rules for the sake of rules. It's about making choices to achieve a desired effect in our writing.
Right.
Whether it's choosing the right words, structuring our sentences, or wielding punctuation like a conductor, every decision contributes to the impact of our message.
That's such a great way to put it. It's like we're not just writing words, we're crafting experiences for our readers, and understanding grammar gives us the tools to make those experiences more engaging and impactful and meaningful.
Yeah, definitely. You know, it's fascinating how even the smallest details of grammar can impact how we communicate. We often think of grammar as these rigid rules,
Yeah.
but it's really like a toolkit for crafting meaning.
I love that perspective. Like, we're not just learning grammar, we're like language architects,
Right.
shaping our words to create a specific effect.
Exactly.
Speaking of effects, I think it's time to go back to that funny example we talked about earlier, the one about how a comma can save a grandma's life.
Oh, yeah. Let's eat grandma versus let's eat grandma.
Right.
A classic example of how just one comma can totally change the meaning of a sentence.
It makes you think twice about those little commas.
Right.
Without that comma, it sounds like something from a horror movie.
Yeah.
But with the comma, it's just a nice invitation to dinner.
It shows the power of punctuation to really guide how the reader understands the sentence.
Right.
Imagine reading that sentence aloud. The comma tells you where to pause, and it creates a different rhythm and emphasis.
It's like sometimes when you're reading a book and you have to go back and reread a sentence because you missed a comma and the meaning completely changes. It's frustrating, but it also makes you realize how much those little marks matter.
Yeah, they're tiny but important.
Exactly, like they're the hinges that hold everything together.
Right.
Speaking of things falling apart, let's go back to subject-verb agreement for a minute.
Yeah.
It's one of those basic grammar concepts, but it can be surprisingly tricky even for experienced writers.
Yeah.
I think it deserves a deeper dive considering how much confusion it can cause.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that native speakers do intuitively.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start to analyze the rules, it can be a little complex.
Right.
Remember, singular subjects need singular verbs.
Yeah.
Plural subjects need plural verbs.
Right. Like the dog barks versus the dogs bark.
Exactly.
But what about those tricky collective nouns we were talking about earlier? Like
Right.
the ones that can be either singular or plural.
Those are the ones that really test your understanding. It really all comes down to how you're using it. If you're emphasizing the group as one unit, you would use a singular verb. For example, the jury has reached a verdict.
Right.
But if you're focusing on the members of the group, you use a plural verb like the jury are arguing amongst themselves.
It's like you have to decide if you're zooming in on the group or zooming out to see the individual parts.
That's a good way to put it.
It's subtle, but it makes a big difference in how we understand the sentence.
Exactly. And that's what makes subject-verb agreement so important. It helps us to say what we mean with precision.
Right.
It's like choosing the right tool for the job.
Right.
If you use a hammer when you need a screwdriver, it's not going to work.
That's a great analogy.
I try.
And it makes me wonder, have you ever noticed how subject-verb agreement affects the tone of a piece of writing? Like, can it make a sentence sound more formal or informal?
Hmm, that's interesting. Yeah, I think subject-verb agreement can definitely change the tone of writing.
Oh,
Like using singular verbs with collective nouns can create a formal or authoritative tone, whereas plural verbs can make it sound more conversational and relatable.
so it's like we're adding another layer of meaning without even realizing it.
Yeah, almost subconsciously.
Yeah, but it makes a difference.
It does.
So I know we've been focusing a lot on sentences, but I think it's time to step back and talk about tenses.
Okay.
After all, tenses are how we navigate the flow of time in our writing.
Right. Tenses are like a time machine.
I like
They
that.
allow us to transport our reader to the past or ground them in the present or launch them into the future.
And just like a time machine, they give us the power to control how the story flows and create a sense of time.
Exactly.
It's like we use tenses all the time without thinking about it. It's so ingrained in our language.
It is.
But when you start to think about past, present, and future tense, it's like unlocking a new level of understanding of language.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion, revealing that structure underneath.
And it's amazing that even though we have these specific labels for tenses, the way we use them can be so nuanced.
Yeah, it's true.
Like, we can use the present tense to talk about things happening now, but we can also use it to talk about truths or to make a story feel immediate.
Yeah, and the past tense isn't just for talking about historical events.
Right.
It can be used to create a sense of distance or to show a change over time.
So it's like we're not just talking about when things happen, but also how we want the reader to experience those events.
Right.
It's like we're composing a symphony of time,
I like that.
using tenses to kind of like orchestrate the flow.
And just like a composer picks each note, we can choose our tenses to evoke certain emotions or create suspense.
I'm starting to see tenses in a whole new light.
Good.
It's not just about getting the grammar right, it's about using tenses to tell a better story.
Yeah, you're controlling the pacing and the flow,
Right.
creating a more immersive experience for the reader.
Now, I know we've been like geeking out about grammar for a while now, but have you ever had a moment where you realized that understanding tenses improved your writing?
I think one of the most powerful ways to use tenses is to create that sense of urgency.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
if you're writing a dramatic scene, switching to present tense can pull the reader in.
Oh, I can see that, like putting the reader right in the action.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to try that.
Yeah. Experiment with different tenses and see how they enhance your writing.
Now, before we move on, I can't resist going back to those double negatives.
Oh, yeah, those pesky double
They're
negatives.
like grammar gremlins.
Sneaking in and messing things up.
Right.
Double negatives make your writing sound awkward and confusing.
Yeah.
It's like trying to walk in two directions at once.
It's like one of those optical illusions that just makes your brain hurt, except instead of messing with your vision, it's messing with your understanding.
It's true. And what's funny is that double negatives are often used intentionally in informal speech or dialects to create a certain effect.
Right.
But in formal writing, it's usually incorrect and can make the writing seem less polished.
So it's all about context. Sometimes a double negative might be used for humor,
Right.
but in other situations, it can just sound confusing. It's like wearing a tuxedo to a barbecue.
Exactly. It just doesn't fit.
So speaking of things that don't fit, I think it's time to move on to our final segment where we'll wrap up this grammar deep dive and leave you with some final thoughts. Welcome back to our grammar deep dive. We've covered so much, like from sentence structure to tenses.
It really is amazing how much depth there is to grammar.
Yeah.
And speaking of things we shouldn't take for granted, the video ended by talking about practice. It's easy to get caught up in the theory of grammar,
Mm-hmm.
but the real magic happens when we use that knowledge.
Absolutely. It's like learning an instrument you can study all day long, but you won't be a musician until you start playing.
Yeah, and the great thing is you can practice grammar anywhere, anytime.
Right.
Every email, every text, even a grocery list is an opportunity to practice.
I love that perspective. It's like we're surrounded by chances to improve.
Right.
It's just about being more aware.
Yeah, and the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. It's like riding a bike. At first,
Mhm.
it's hard, but then it's second nature.
I know we've been talking a lot about the technical side of grammar, the rules and structure.
Right.
But how do you think understanding those things helps someone be more persuasive or creative in their writing?
That's a great question.
Mm.
I think that when you know grammar, you can focus more on the art of writing.
Mm.
You can play with sentence structure or word choice and really use punctuation to get your point across.
It's like knowing the rules of a game lets you bend them.
Exactly. When you know grammar, you're not afraid to take risks.
Right. You're not worried about making mistakes.
And that freedom to experiment is where the creativity comes in.
So it's like having all the tools you need to create something amazing.
I think that's a great way to put it.
I think we've reached the end of our grammar journey.
It has been a journey.
We've really explored how language works,
Hmm.
And I feel a lot more confident in my writing now.
That's great to hear.
What about you?
It's been great exploring the world of grammar with you.
Yeah,
And just remember, language is a powerful tool.
it is.
Knowing how to use it opens up a world of possibility. So keep learning, keep practicing, and keep writing.
That is some great advice. Thanks for joining me on this grammar adventure.
It was my pleasure.
We'll see everyone next time on The Deep Dive.
All right. Welcome to your deep dive on simple grammar rules. Looks like we've got a pretty hefty stack of articles and notes here. You guys really want to dig into the building blocks of language.
Always a good idea. Yeah, language, it's always changing, but like you said, those fundamentals, those are always going to be important. For clear communication, anyway.
I was reading somewhere, actually, that mastering grammar, it's almost like learning, the code of clear thinking. I thought that was really cool. It's fascinating how all these little tiny details can really change the way we express ourselves, how we understand each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why it's good to come back to basics sometimes, like sharpening your tools, your
Yeah.
thinking tools.
Exactly. So let's start with the foundation. Subject, verb, object.
Mm.
The essentials. I mean, we all learn this in school, but, why does it still matter if you're already writing all the time?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's easy to get lost in the weeds, when you're writing and forget about the core pieces. But if you think about it, the subject, well, that's the who or the what, the thing that's driving the sentence. And the verb, well, that's the engine. It's what's making the action happen. And the object, that's where the action's going. That's where it lands. So without them, it's like a sputtering engine, not a smooth ride.
So it's not about being like a grammar stickler, really. More about making sure that your reader can follow along
Mm-hmm.
effortlessly.
Exactly. If you know your subject, verb, object, then your writing's going to be clearer, more impactful, easy to understand. Smooth ride for the reader, no bumps in the road.
Well, speaking of bumps in the road, let's talk about those tricky words that get us all, those homophones. The ones you have to like double check in emails before you
Yeah.
hit send.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There. I mean, those can trip up even, seasoned writers.
Oh, I can't tell you how many times I've almost sent an email that says they're going to the meeting. It's a classic. But I was looking through the stuff you sent, and there's some pretty clever tricks in there to keep them straight.
Oh, yeah. Like, for example, think of it like their possessions. It shows who owns something, and there, well, that's like pointing, like over there, it's a place.
Yeah.
And there, that's just, they are all squished together.
I think it really helps to have those visuals, like you're painting a picture in your mind that sort of anchors the meaning.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of anchoring meaning, have you ever thought about how powerful punctuation can be?
Punctuation. I mean, it's not just about rules, right? It's also about how you guide the reader, adding all those little nuances that bring the writing to life.
It's like musical notation for your writing. A good comma. That can create a dramatic pause, semicolon. That can create tension. You wouldn't believe how much you can change the meaning just by, swapping out a comma for a dash.
It's like punctuation gives you all the controls for the reader's experience. You can set the pace, you can set the tone.
Exactly. It's about creating a rhythm, right? So the reader stays engaged. So they understand what you're saying and how you're saying it.
Now let's tackle another one of those grammar hurdles that gets a lot of people. Subject-verb agreement. This one can be tricky, especially when you throw in collective nouns, those indefinite pronouns.
For sure. But the most important thing to remember is that the verb has got to agree with its subject. So, singular subject, singular verb, plural subject, plural verb.
Yeah, that seems pretty simple. But then you get those collective nouns like team or family. Those can get a bit fuzzy. The source material goes into that a bit.
Well, the key is, are you talking about the group as one unit or as individuals? Like you could say, the team is winning. Right there, you're treating them like one thing, but you could also say, the team are debating their next strategy. See, there you're emphasizing the individual members.
So the context really matters when you're deciding how to handle those collective nouns.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and don't forget about those indefinite pronouns like everyone or nobody. They sound plural, but they're actually singular. So it would be everyone is happy, not everyone are happy.
It's all about those little distinctions. You miss one and boom, your writing's not as accurate as it could be.
So many little traps. Speaking of traps, let's talk about double negatives. those can really, really mess with the meaning of what you're trying to say.
I remember this comedy sketch I saw once, and the guy kept saying, "I ain't got no time for this," which of course means he does have time. It was hilarious.
That's exactly what double negatives can do. It's like saying, I don't have no money, when what you mean is, I have money. The two negatives sort of cancel each other out. You end up with a positive meaning.
So you got to watch out for those sneaky double negatives.
Yeah.
Stick to one negative and your meaning is going to be a lot clearer.
Exactly. Double negatives make you sound informal, maybe even like grammatically incorrect. If you want to be precise, stick to one negative word and make sure it's the right one.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. Sentence basics, punctuation, all those tricky words.
It's amazing how these simple rules, how much impact they have on the way we write, the way we express ourselves.
Yeah. It's like we're cracking the code of language.
Yeah.
Figuring out how all these little details, how they work together to create meaning and impact.
Now let's talk about something I find really interesting. Verb tenses. They're like time travel devices for writers, right? Taking the reader to different points in time. And, all the stuff you sent over really emphasize how important it is to be consistent with your verb tenses.
Oh, yes, absolutely. If you want the flow of time to be smooth in your writing, you got to keep those tenses consistent. Imagine reading a story where the tenses keep jumping around for no reason. It'd be so jarring, so confusing.
It'd be like watching a movie where the scenes are all jumbled up. You'd have no idea what was going on. Exactly. I mean, there's lots of different verb tenses, but if you just master those basic ones, past, present, future, that'll give you a really solid foundation. It's like learning your primary colors before you start mixing all those fancy shades.
Lay the groundwork, right, before you get into the more complicated stuff.
Exactly. And it's like anything creative. Once you know the basics, you can start experimenting, playing around with the language in more, interesting ways, more sophisticated ways.
So you mentioned before about clear writing being connected to clear thinking.
Yeah.
I've definitely found that to be true. Like if I'm struggling to get my thoughts down on paper, it usually means I haven't fully figured out what I'm trying to say in my head.
That's so true. Writing makes you slow down, makes you really look at what you're thinking, organize it all in a logical way. And when you're paying attention to your grammar, you're refining that process, making sure your ideas aren't just clear, but, precise and impactful too.
Grammar's like the framework, the scaffolding for your thoughts. It's crazy to think that the way we use language actually shapes how we think.
Yeah, it really shows how connected those two things are, language and thought. And it makes me wonder, if we really work on our grammar, could that help us make better decisions in other parts of our lives, I mean?
Ooh, that's a good question. Like, grammar's not just these rules for writers. Maybe it's also a tool for, problem solving, for thinking more clearly.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that language. It's not just about communicating. It's a tool that can shape how we think, how we interact with the world around us. So as we keep going with this deep dive into simple grammar rules, think about how you can use grammar not just to improve your writing, but also to make your thinking sharper, to make better choices. It's recognizing that language can really enhance our lives in so many different ways. It's pretty amazing, right? How even these simple grammar rules can have such a huge impact on, how we communicate.
It's like those tiny little tweaks you make to a recipe.
Yeah.
It totally transforms the flavor.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of transformations, why don't we go back to that material you sent over? Put some of this stuff into practice. Ready to get our hands dirty with some examples.
I'm always up for a grammar workout. Let's see what we've got.
Okay. So how about this? This is from one of those articles. The sentence is, the birds sing their cheerful melody. Can you break it down for me? Subject, verb, object.
Right, let's see. Birds. They're the ones doing the action, right? So that's the subject, and the action is sing. So that's our verb. What are they singing? Their cheerful melody. That's got to be the object then.
Boom! Nailed it. You've got a good eye for the sentence parts. Okay, now let's try one that's a little trickier. Nobody enjoys long meetings. What's going on with the subject-verb agreement there?
This is where those indefinite pronouns get ya. Nobody, it sounds like it's a bunch of people, but it's actually singular. So the verb should be enjoys, not enjoy.
Hey.
You got it. It's one of those little things that can trip people up. But if you understand it, you can write so much more clearly, so much more precisely. Something else I was looking at in the source material, they talk about using colons and semicolons, like to add emphasis or separate those ideas that are really closely connected. Can you tell me a bit more about how to use those effectively?
Okay, so imagine you want to, really build up to something, like a list. You could say she had 3 main goals: to write a novel, to travel the world, and to learn a new language. the colon there. It's like a drum roll.
Ooh, I like that. Makes it sound way more dramatic.
Now, semicolons. Those are good for connecting two sentences that could stand on their own, but they flow better together. Like, he loved to read. It was his escape from reality.
It's like this little pause. There's a little moment of reflection before you move on to the next thought.
Yeah, exactly. Makes your writing more sophisticated, more nuanced. You can really play around with the emphasis.
All right, let's talk about those tricky words again, There. We're like little grammar ninjas hiding in the shadows.
I have a trick for there. Just remember, it's short for they are. If you can swap those two in the sentence and it makes sense, then you know you're good.
And for there and there, I like to think of pictures. There is like holding something, like their belongings, and there is like pointing to a spot. Over there.
Those are really good ways to remember. It's all about those little mental anchors. Make the rules stick.
Okay, so sticking to the rules. What about double negatives? The source material we've got here, it really stresses how they can mess with your meaning, make you sound, like you don't know grammar.
It's like a knot. The more you try to untangle it, the worse it gets. Double negatives just confuse everything because, well, they cancel each other out. You end up saying the opposite of what you mean.
Like that song, right? I can't get no satisfaction. If you think about it, he's actually saying he can get satisfaction.
Yep, that's exactly it. So to avoid all that mess, just pick one negative word and stick with it. Instead of I don't have no money, say I don't have any money or I have no money.
Keep it clean. Keep it simple. Make sure people understand exactly what you mean. No accidental plot twists.
Okay, so verb tenses again. Remember we were talking about how they're like time travel. It's all about moving the reader through the story. And again, the source material really highlights how important consistency is with those tenses.
If you're telling a story, it's so important. If those tenses are shifting smoothly, it draws the reader right in. They're experiencing it all with you. No jarring jumps.
Right. Imagine reading a novel and the author keeps flipping between past, present, future, just randomly. It'd be a nightmare, like a movie with all the scenes out of order.
Like one of those time travel movies, where they keep jumping back and forth. If it's not done well, you just get totally lost.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot to learn about verb tenses, but honestly, if you can just master the basics, past, present, future, that'll get you so far. It's like learning the basic steps before you try to do a fancy dance routine.
Get that foundation solid,
Yeah.
right? Then you can get fancy later.
Exactly. It's just like anything creative. Master the fundamentals, and then you can really start to play around. Get more nuanced, more sophisticated with your choices.
So remember when we were talking about how clear writing is connected to clear thinking?
Yeah.
I find that so fascinating. I've noticed that whenever my writing's a mess, it's usually because my thoughts are a mess too.
Oh, totally. Writing forces you to, actually think about what you're trying to say, organize it all in a way that makes sense. And when you're really paying attention to your grammar, it's like you're taking that process a step further,
Yeah.
making sure your ideas are not just clear, but precise and impactful.
Grammar's like the blueprint, the scaffolding for your thoughts. It's kind of wild to think that the way we use language actually changes the way we think.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how connected those two things are, language and thought. Makes you wonder, like, if we put more effort into our grammar, would that actually make us better decision makers in other parts of our lives, I mean?
That's a really interesting question. Like, grammar's not just about rules for writers. Maybe it's a tool we can all use to solve problems, to think more clearly about everything.
Exactly. It's about understanding that language isn't just about, communicating. It's this powerful tool that can shape our thoughts, how we see the world, how we interact with everything around us. So as we go further into this deep dive on simple grammar rules, think about how you can use grammar to not only become a better writer, but also to think more clearly, to make smarter choices. It's recognizing that language can truly, truly make our lives better in so many ways.
Welcome back to your deep dive. We've been talking about how powerful language can be. And, just those small changes in grammar can really change how your message comes across.
It really is powerful. Like, when you're tuning an instrument, you make a tiny little adjustment, and suddenly you've gone from a bad note to this beautiful sound.
I was looking at the stuff you sent over, and they were talking about verb tenses and how they're like, time travel devices for writers. I love that. It's like you can take your reader to all these different moments, build suspense, intrigue, or even just give them a sense of history.
What's really neat is that once you understand how to use verb tenses, you can really control the flow of the story. As a writer, I mean, you can speed things up, slow things down, you can have flashbacks, you can hint at things that are going to happen later, all with these subtle changes in the verbs.
I remember reading this mystery novel, and the author was so good at shifting between past and present tense. They were dropping clues, building the suspense. It was amazing. By the end, it felt like I was right there with the detective, living through the whole thing.
That's what I love about language. When it's really good, it's not just about information. It's about making the reader feel something, giving them an experience, a
Yeah.
connection.
One thing that the source material really emphasized was the importance of practicing. When it comes to mastering grammar, it's easy to get stuck on the theory, but really you've got to put it into practice.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like, when you're learning to play an instrument or learning a new language, you can read all the books, but you got to actually do it to really get it.
And just like with anything new, you got to be patient. You're going to make mistakes. Oh, believe me, I've made plenty of grammar mistakes. But you learn from every one right now.
That's when you really start to understand it, when you're like, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. And then you figure out why and how to fix it. That's when it clicks. It becomes part of you.
And then once you're comfortable with the rules, you can start to, bend them a little,
Yeah.
play around, find your own style. Like, I don't know, a chef who knows all the basics and then starts creating their own, signature dishes.
Exactly. You go from following the recipe to like being an artist. You add your own special touch, and then boom, you've made something new and amazing.
So we're wrapping up this deep dive.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who's just starting out? Someone who wants to master grammar.
Enjoy it. Don't be scared to try things, to make mistakes, ask questions, remember that language. It's alive. It's always changing, so there's always something new to learn.
I love that. It's not about being perfect. It's about exploring, learning, getting better at something you love. It's a journey.
And it's not just about rules. It's about connecting with people. It's about taking what's in your head and putting it out there so other people can understand it. So as you keep going with this whole grammar thing, think about how you can use these tools to talk to people better, to make real connections and to make sure that your voice is heard.
That's a great way to put it. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed exploring all these simple grammar rules with us. We hope you feel inspired to keep learning about language. Thanks for diving in with us.